Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and since we are in November and it's election season, I wanted to highlight a 19th century presidential election that I would say many people give little thought to, but had interesting political intrigue, and I think you'll enjoy it. The year was 1848, and the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, were battling it out on the national stage. The Whigs rose up in opposition to Andrew Jackson's presidency, and Jackson himself had been the foundation of the Democratic Party through the grassroots effort of Martin Van Buren. By the late 1840s, these two parties had been battling it out, attempting to wrestle control of Congress and the presidency away from the other. The Whigs were desperate for a president. Jackson and Van Buren, the 7th and 8th presidents, were both Democrats. When William Henry Harrison won the presidency in 1840, the Whigs rejoiced. They had played a great political game getting him elected by putting John Tyler in as vice president. Tyler was a former Democrat and a Southerner, which the Whigs knew would get them votes in the South and helped put Harrison in as president. However, Harrison died a month into his presidency, placing Tyler in as president. Tyler's Democratic ideology rose to the surface as president. So even though the Whigs had won the presidency, they now had a Democratic president, essentially. James K. Polk, Jackson's hand-picked successor, would win the next presidential election, securing another presidency for the Democrats in 1844. Now, in 1848, the Whigs were desperate to send a Whig into the White House. The Whigs put forward Zachary Taylor as their candidate for president, with Millard Fillmore as the vice president. Taylor had been born in Virginia but raised in Kentucky, and his career had been in the military. By that stage in his career, he lived in Louisiana on his plantation, where he owned over 100 slaves. Taylor was a hero of the Mexican-American War, and since he was no politician, his political credentials were dubious, but that worked to his advantage and disadvantages. He had little if any political skeletons in his closet. No one could point to a piece of legislation he passed and criticize it. But this also meant that Democrats could point out that he was unfit for the job. For instance, Taylor had never cast a vote in an election. The Democrats put forward Cass of Michigan as their candidate for the presidency, with William Butler as his vice president. Cass was born in New Hampshire, but made his way west, becoming the U.S. Marshal of Ohio. He served in the War of 1812, achieving the rank of brigadier general. After the war, he resigned and because of his military service, was made governor of the Michigan Territory. He served as the Secretary of War under Jackson, then as U.S. Minister to France, then as a U.S. Senator from Michigan. A new party emerged that catered to the anti-slavery sections of both the Whig and Democratic parties. The Free Soil Party nominated Martin Van Buren, the former one-term president. Van Buren had been a Democrat, but was against the expansion of slavery into the territories. This party brought together voters from each party who did not like the pro-slavery stances that both the Whigs and the Democrats held. The Whigs and the Democrats had politicians and constituents both north and south, but depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon line you were on, determined how you viewed the candidates. For example, the Whig Party, when trying to court Democrats over to their side in the South or secure the support of their Whig constituents in that section, would emphasize Taylor's slaveholding status. This assured the Southerners that slavery would be safe under his presidency. Likewise, they would attack Cass for being a Northerner, stating that he may support slavery personally, but would cave to his Northern constituents' pressure to stop the expansion of slavery. When Whigs attempted to keep their constituents in the North, they knew Taylor's slaveholder status would be repulsive to anti-slavery Whigs. Men like Abraham Lincoln, a firm Whig, issued statements advocating for Taylor, stating that he may be a slaveholder, but was a constitutionalist, unlike Jackson, who used his veto power to take away the powers of Congress, granted to it by the Constitution. So, if anti-expansion legislation came across his desk in the White House, he would sign it. As one historian put it, neither Whigs nor Democrats wanted the slavery extension issue to become prominent enough to dominate the election. The Free Soilers obviously disagreed. Most of them did not believe that it would, but party strategists were well aware that sectional issues were now a part of the complex issues in the political arena, and that they had to deal with them in some fashion as they dealt with other issues they confronted, those that already existed or those that arose during the course of a campaign. The Whig Party itself was built upon the American system created by Henry Clay. That platform supported a national bank to secure the nation's finances, advocated for internal improvements or infrastructure on a national scale using federal dollars, and protective tariffs to protect American businesses. The Whigs attacked Cass by saying he would let the country's infrastructure collapse or become non-existent, that American businesses would fail under a Democratic president, and without a stable federal money system, the country would fall into economic ruin. Democrats were expansionists, wanting to extend the country's boundaries. They supported the war with Mexico, which many Whigs were against, because they thought it was an unjust war and/or it was a ploy to expand slavery by adding more territory to the country. One campaign pamphlet vividly noted, "Cass seems to look upon the United States as if the country were some monster reptile that must subsist and swell its huge, unsightly bulk by gorging itself with every living thing, small and great, that comes in its way." The Boston Atlas cautioned that the election of Cass will be followed by wars of aggression on weak neighboring republics, bringing as their inevitable result acquisition of territory, amalgamation with a barbarous, hostile population, further extension of slavery, and a public debt. A Southern Whig member of Congress summed up the case. Whereas the Democratic Party is committed to a policy which leads to aggression, war, and conquest, the Whigs desire to preserve peace with all the world, to stimulate the industry, and to develop the resources of the country. Democrats worked hard to keep their political power. They based most of their published material, highlighting their platform, on their continued foundation of lessened federal power. Democrats pointed to the Whigs' push for federal dollars to build infrastructure, their high tariffs that hurt the American consumer, and a central banking system that Democrats believed put too much power in the hands of the few. Democrats warned, endeavoring to conceal their purpose of fastening unadulterated federalism upon the government. The Whigs labored to keep in their background the cherished policy of special privileges for the few. The Democrats used their expansionist policies to support their patriotism. They asserted, "Taylor is the candidate of the Mexican Whigs, the object of which is to defeat and destroy the American patriots whom he led to victory in Mexico. What spectacle can be more disgusting? As well might he attempt to reinstate Benedict Arnold and the Tories of the Revolution in the affections of the American people as the Whig allies of Mexico, who are now clinging to his skirts." Whigs opposed immigrants and immigration, favoring a more homogenized country. That pushed the immigrants to the Democratic Party. Democrats attracted immigrants to their party because of their liberal views toward the reform movements and other aspects of individual freedoms. The party of Jackson emphasized the Whigs' connection to nativists who condemned Catholics, the Irish, and various immigrants, and cultivated a strong base of voters through their efforts. Taylor's lack of political experience was ripe for the picking for the Democrats. They would claim that Whigs didn't stand for anything because their vagueness on the issues of the time. They claimed the Whigs were that party which either has no principles or is ashamed to express them, and their candidate follows that unacceptable course with his storehouse of unknown political principles. Unlike the Whigs, Cass and his colleagues do not seek to decoy to their side the false or the unwary of other parties. They scorn efforts to corrupt and seduce or to mislead and entrap, by allurements and rewards, or by device or trickery, the rank and file of their enemy. The slavery issue threatened to unseat many Democratic politicians, especially as the issue hit new heights. Slowly, Northern Democrats began wavering and leaning toward the Free Soil Party, being sick of their Southern counterparts who wanted to ensure slavery's expansion to the territories. So, the Democratic Party, attempting to keep its members together, stressed unity and pleaded with its Northern members to support Cass because if the party wasn't unified, then their policies would die with a Whig-controlled Congress, Senate, and presidency. The party also needed to assure its Southern members that Cass would not turn on them and deny slavery's expansion. They explained that Cass was sympathetic to the South and that his support of popular sovereignty continued the idea of a democratic government and therefore the core principles of the party. The Free Soil Party's platform read, "It was the settled policy of the nation at its outset not to extend, nationalize, or encourage, but to limit, localize, and discourage slavery, and to this policy, which should never have been departed from, the government ought to return." The Free Soil Party was going to pull politicians and voters from both parties, especially in the North. Abolitionists were the obvious voters for the Free Soil Party, but you had many Northerners who were indifferent to slavery or how slaves were treated. Why would they be in favor of the Free Soil Party and its restriction of slavery into the territories? Many Northerners thought about their children and themselves who might move west for the available land. However, they knew that if plantation owners settled out there, claiming large tracts of land that could be worked with slave labor, diminished the amount of land available, and the enslaved created a significant competition in labor. So even if someone did not care about slaves, they did care about their futures in the Western territories if they or their children wanted to settle there. That is why the Whigs and the Democrats worked so hard to keep their Northern voters away from the Free Soil Party. The Free Soilers called the Whigs and the Democrats hypocrites for stating one stance on slavery in the North and one stance in the South. They believed the two parties avoided the largest issue in the country, and it was only growing larger. The polls opened on November 7, 1848, and voters and promoters flocked to them with eagerness. At this point in the country's history, those who could vote were determined by the states themselves. Mostly it was white adult males. African American men could vote in a few, but only a few northern states, mostly in New England, under the same terms as their white counterparts. In New York State, they could cast ballots as well, but had to meet a property requirement that was not imposed on anyone else in the state. When the returns had been counted, first at the local level, then officially tallied in state capitals, a process that took some days, Zachary Taylor won the battle for a majority of the 290 electoral votes in play. He won 163 from 15 states to Cass's 127, also from 15 states. Taylor received just more than 1,360,000 popular votes, 47.1% of the national total, to Cass's 1,220,000 plus, and 42.7% of the whole number cast. Martin Van Buren received just more than 290,000 votes, 10.1% of the national tally, and 14.1% when only returns from the northern states were computed. The Free Soil candidate received votes in 17 states, including the border slave states of Maryland and Delaware. He came in second in several, including New York, Vermont, and Massachusetts, where in each he pushed Cass into third place. Although he received votes throughout the North, in many places they totaled only very few. Finally, there was a scattering of ballots in different areas for other candidates, including Garrett Smith and the Liberty League, who won just more than 2,500 votes in the North, many of them in New York State, with several hundred other votes cast for other names, a few of them familiar, but many not. Taylor had won the presidency, but the Whigs were not as thrilled as they hoped. Congress, where they had a majority, switched to the Democrats, and the Senate remained in Democratic hands. Why then did Taylor win the presidency? 3 reasons stand out. One is that Martin Van Buren drew many Northern Democrats to the Free Soilers. Although historians have debated how much his inclusion in the election impacted Taylor's win, still having a prominent Democrat represent another party would naturally gain voters from that party. 2, the Whigs had done a great job of catering their discussions to the region in which they were campaigning, whether they were in the North or the South. 3, Democrat voters had not shown up. Some studies suggest that 25% of Democrat voters who voted in 1844 did not vote in 1848 in the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Rather than vote against their party, who nominated a Northerner, they simply abstained from voting entirely.